this moment when I could really focus on the kind of creation of beauty and the kind of moment of specialness that's so important for me. And I loved singing together with people, and I loved being at the summer camps that I went to. And even though I was not a fan of the theology that I encountered in religion in the Anglican Church at that time in England, I still love the beauty of cathedrals, for example. So I've always been really, just in my own life, navigating the boundaries, excuse me, navigating the boundaries of kind of the secular world and the sacred world. And that's been a theme that's continued, certainly in my professional life. So what I want to share with you is just about 20-25 minutes or so of some insights from my work. So I'm going to share my screen and bring us to this work that really started off the work that I do now. And it started as a graduate student at Harvard Divinity School with my colleague, Angie Thurston, where we kept seeing these really epic trends changing in what religion looks like in the United States. And I should stress that I'm going to just talk about the United States, but Kamsi assures me that there may be some interesting parallels to the Nigerian context as well. So that will be for you to tell me. But let me give you the big picture first of all, which is that more and more Americans are less and less traditionally religious. So what you're looking here is a number of lines for each generation and the increase in disaffiliation. So the process of stepping away from identifying, I will give you the power to control my screen. Yes, okay, there we go. Or maybe I can't do that. Okay, we'll see. Anyway, so this image here that we're looking at is a graph with multiple generations, each one moving towards disaffiliation, moving away from institutional religion. And most importantly, of course, it's the millennial generation that we see in purple at the top there, but it's true across every generation. And even more recent figures make it even more so amongst Gen Z. So this is really a kind of an epic change that we're seeing. It's not just a little trend, it's really a multi-generational trend. More and more people, less and less traditionally religious. Now that has led in the United States to a significant institutional crisis. The average, the kind of average guess that we've been seeing. Kamsi, do you want me to approve this request for remote control of my screen, or is this someone else who's doing that?
No, that is not me. So don't.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not going to approve that. All right. It must be someone else who's named the same name as you have, unfortunately. So maybe we can find them and ask them to leave. So there is an institutional crisis. On average, the guess is that about 3,500 churches close in the United States every year, which is a significant number. Seminaries are shrinking or closing down. In a Jewish context, nearly 70% of non-Orthodox Jews marry outside of their faith, which is a real challenge for Jewish institutions because there's a real focus on Jewish intermarriage, on keeping people Jewish by having them marry other Jews. But all of this in a religious story is part of a much wider change in society, a growing distrust of institutions, whether they're in the media, in business, in government, and of course, even in science, as we've seen over the last couple of years. So this isn't just about religion. There's a bigger picture that's happening here. Now, what that leads to is a growing cultural crisis also. This sense that more and more people are unaffiliated with religious institution doesn't mean that more and more of them are actively atheist or completely uninterested in religion. And forgive me, Kamsi, I'm still getting a lot of Zoom requests here, so I'm hoping we can find whoever is there.
I just deleted the person. I just took
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, beautiful. So those figures, what that looks like is 2 out of 3 people who say they're not traditionally religious still believe in God, and 1 in 5 even pray every day. So there isn't this hard line, as you all know, between institutional affiliation and outright kind of disinterest in spirituality or community or religion. There's a much bigger gray zone that lives between those two extremes. Something we started describing as kind of spiritual homelessness, right? People still have a spirituality, but they don't have an institutional congregational home. Now, at the same time as we've seen those figures increase in the United States, we've seen more and more people kind of recognize their experience of isolation and loneliness. So 1 in 4 Americans say that they have nobody to talk to about the things that matter most. And that includes a spouse or family members, 1 in 4. And 1 in 5 said they only have one person that they can confide in. So there's a real experience of disconnection that people have. And what science is now telling us is that that experience of loneliness reduces life expectancy more than obesity or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this has a real health impact, this disconnection that people are experiencing. Now, that's a story that a lot of people are telling. And what Angie and I wanted to share in our work was a different story, something that was more hopeful. And so as Kamsi was saying, we found really interesting stories of connection in all sorts of places. The first one being the fitness world. This is a picture of people doing CrossFit together. Now, these kind of boutique gyms or people getting together to work out together was not your traditional, solo workout. These are group classes that work out together. And I always like to joke, how do you know if someone is vegan, went to Harvard, or does CrossFit? Well, the answer is they'll tell you, because there is a very kind of evangelical culture about CrossFit and other group workout programs that is very built into the culture, is that you try and recruit other people. So much so that if you want to open your own CrossFit gym, this is now a few years ago, so I'm not sure if it's still true, but it certainly was a few years ago. All you had to do, you had to attend a 2-day seminar, and you had to write a letter to say how your life had been changed by CrossFit and how you wanted to change other people's lives with CrossFit. So if that doesn't remind you of evangelicalism, I don't know what does. But there's a real sense of like going out into the world and changing, kind of recruiting people into the CrossFit fold. Of course, there's a very disciplined culture of regular practice, but there was also a softer side that I was surprised to find out. People looking after each other's pets when they went on vacation, or taking each other to the hospital if they had an appointment and they needed a ride. People, if someone got sick in their CrossFit gym, would host fundraisers to support the costs of their cancer the cancer treatment, for example. We even saw CrossFit gyms getting involved with local politics to impact local legislation around the labeling of sugar in food and drinks. So CrossFit really started to fund research against the sugar lobby in America. Like it became an active political force in this really interesting way. So here on the one hand is this completely secular community, but when you start looking at it, it's doing kind of religious things, the things you would expect to see in a congregation. The same was true with individual relationships. We heard stories of people getting married or hosting funerals in their CrossFit gym. If they were moving across the country after living in New York for a while and they were going to Cincinnati, let's say, they might host their leaving barbecue in their CrossFit gym. So it was a real hub of community. So the more we looked at it, the more we saw these themes of CrossFit being a place of evangelism. They have particular workouts that they name after soldiers or service people in the fire brigade or the police who have died in the line of service. They name a workout, so they're kind of honoring the dead. The leaders of each CrossFit gym started talking about not just like building a business and running a community, but shepherding a flock. And as I said, caring for the sick. So all of these themes started to look very, very religious, but it wasn't just at CrossFit. This is a picture of Artisans Asylum in Somerville, Massachusetts, again in the US, where people get together. It's a maker space. So people get together to make jewelry or robots or do woodwork or welding, all sorts of things that you need tools and materials for and you want to make something. This is the place that you get to go. So it's a big open space with lots and lots of desks and lots of machinery. And so on the one hand, you think, okay, completely secular creative space, but this was also a community that gathered around particular festivals. So for their Thanksgiving celebration, everyone would not just bring a potluck dish, right, a dish to contribute, but they would also bring a thing that they had made that year. And so it sort of became this kind of incredible like table filled with incredible creations that was celebrating creativity. We heard about, because the space is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that this kind of became a refuge for people, certainly in the middle of the night, when they were worried about their own destructive behavior. That might have been around addiction, it might have been around self-harm. And even for people who didn't have secure housing, they started to use this place as a place to sleep. Now, what that meant was that the owners and the leaders of this community started to realize, there's a housing issue, there's a housing shortage in the town that we live in. How can we advocate for better housing? So again, you started to see sort of justice work coming out of the community that was gathering. People would seek out mentors and people to help teach them the skills and the kind of technical elements of the making. But what came out of that too were friendships across generations. Again, something that you might expect to see in a congregation. So we saw this sense of creative formation. We saw this sense of sanctuary, of celebrating the holidays, and this culture of kind of mutual improvement, again, that reminded us of a congregation. I'll give you one more example here. This is the dinner party, and it's not just any dinner party, but this is a community for people in their 20s and 30s who've experienced significant loss. So maybe the death of a parent or the death of a sibling or a loved one at an early age. And so what these dinner parties are is that a volunteer will welcome others who've been matched with them into their home. And again, everyone brings a dish. And then it's a sort of lightly facilitated conversation about your experience of life after losing someone. And again, this starts out as being a secular space, but very quickly becomes more than that. We notice that sense of spiritual accompaniment, of healing. Of course, a small group is a very old tradition in religious communities. But even, if you look a little further, gathering around a table to share a meal in remembrance of someone that you love, well, it reminds me a little bit of Eucharist. So that sense of the kind of core Christian ritual too. So all of these case studies were really part of a much larger field that we started to notice. Here's just a few more. We saw kind of early morning sober dance raves. We saw summer camps for adults. We saw many, many fitness examples. We saw things like the Harry Potter Alliance, which mobilizes fans of not just Harry Potter, but all sorts of fiction to get active in social justice projects in the here and now, in the real world. So we saw more and more of these examples. And if you're a designer of any sort, you'll see there's a lot of even similarity in the color palette and the design language of these logos. There was a real sensibility around this moment. And so what we started to realize that although there was a story of religious decline, what we actually were seeing was a story of religious transformation, that the places people were going and the things that people were doing, they didn't use religious language, but what was happening in those places was still very recognizably spiritual. And so we found 6 themes that connected these organizations that did such diverse things, from grief and loss to fitness to creativity to social justice. The themes that we saw was that sense of social transformation, wanting to get together to make the world better or make the world more fair or more beautiful. A sense of personal transformation, that I could become maybe stronger or smarter or more ethical, or something about me becoming different than how I have been. A very strong sense of accountability, which was surprising to us because often we think about, certainly in a kind of trauma context, accountability is this very painful thing in religious communities, but people were showing up to a lot of these secular spaces wanting to be held accountable to their own intentions, because what we found was that accountability was really an expression of care. If you say that you want to do this, I can show you care by helping you do it, right? By keeping you accountable. Other themes, this sense of creativity, of co-creating an experience together, purpose finding, of being able to articulate and activate my sense of purpose in my life. And finally, and most importantly, people were looking for community. They wanted to be part of a group of similar people. So community building was really, really a key theme. Now, we then continued our research and found all sorts of interesting examples of people who were still religious doing these similar kind of projects outside of a traditional congregation space, but still claiming a religious affiliation. But it often looked very different. So for example, Buddhist Geeks was a group of people who were really interested in Buddhism and Buddhist practice, but they met online. Neighborhood Halakas was a group of Muslims who were gathering in small groups to do text study, but outside of a mosque context. Moishe House was a group for young Jews who wanted to live together and host community events, but outside of a synagogue. The Living School for Action and Contemplation was for Christians interested in the mystics and the kind of medieval wisdom teachers of Christianity, but outside of a traditional church space. So we found over and over again these kind of still religious, but untraditional groups that were forming. And again, it indicated that there was this real shift in what was happening. And so for many years, Angie, myself, and later my colleague Sue started hosting leaders from all of these groups, both the secular ones and the religious ones together. And very quickly, whenever we gathered these people together, you couldn't tell who was who. Were they religious? Were they secular? Were they spiritual? Were they not spiritual? Very quickly, it became kind of one core of leaders. And what we learned about those leaders was that they were creating what they couldn't find themselves. They didn't have it in their lives and they wanted it for themselves. And so they were creating something because they felt they needed it and the world around them needed it. We learned that they were fulfilling pastoral roles. They were accompanying people through life transitions. They were doing the kind of things that a priest or a pastor might do in a traditional religious space. They were leading ritual. They were counseling people in times of loss or other difficulties. And they were often, this was most fascinating to me, the leaders who were leading these new groups had often experienced religious life themselves. Often they were a pastor's kid, or they'd been part of religious summer camps. Like they actually knew religious life very well. And so that gave them the capacity to imagine that rich experience of the best of religious community, but in a very different context, that it looked different. I see Kamsi nodding. So maybe there's some familiarity there in a Nigerian context too. Finally, this is something that we saw over and over again, is that they needed things that anyone in that role would need, and they didn't have access to it. So they felt very isolated in their leadership. They needed training and authorization, the sense that they were legitimate in their leadership. They needed mentors and elders. They needed their own sustenance, right? Water from the well, a place to be spiritually enriched and supported in their own lives. And they needed to figure out financial models that worked for these new communities. Because over and over again, we saw a cool new thing happen. A leader would lead it for 2 to 4 years, and then they would burn out and the thing would disappear. So there were a lot of these new cool projects that wouldn't last because there was no structure that would sustain them financially or in terms of the leadership over time. So what I want to invite you to do is to, I think this is the moment I'm going to ask you to maybe break out into some small groups, just to have a chance to reflect on what resonates and what doesn't. So I want you to think about what resonates for you. What do you recognize from your own context? What challenges you? What doesn't make sense in your context? Maybe it's too specific to America. Maybe it just doesn't make sense in your experience. And then finally, what questions do you have? Because we'll have a good conversation all together after this. So what resonates, what challenges, and what are the questions that you have now? And I'm hoping, Kamsi, that you can invite us into some small groups, maybe for the next couple of minutes.
Okay, I'm about to do that. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for the next 5 minutes. I'm timing it, but I'm about to split us up. And so we're automatically just going to be assigned to random rooms. So goodbye, everyone. See you in 5 minutes.
Great.
It's taking forever. Greetings. No, Ore and I are in the same room. What the hell is this? You're muted.
No. The one person on this group is Sheol. Like everywhere I go, she is.
No, how can you be in the same group?
We can't actually, well, it was random, right?
Yeah, it was randomized.
And it's actually very interesting because like everything he was saying is exactly like why we started. Like it was the sense of the loneliness, the needing this something that we could not find anywhere else. But now I'm more curious about like, now that they've studied all these communities over the years, like what are some of the models that they've realized work? Because we're trying to build something that is sustainable here. Right, over the years, I want to be able to at some point hand over the reins of the table to someone, and it continues with or without me, that kind of thing. So I'm interested in learning like the models that work, but I'm also more interested in him talking about, you know, covenants and community and obligations, because these are things that are scary in a sense.
I like that.
Right. And these are things that he usually talks about, and there's nothing wrong with obligation, and community will always demand obligation of it. It's about how mutual it is. Like if I'm doing my bit and others are not doing their bits, this is where burnout comes in, and many of us can testify to like burnout from communities that we've previously been in. So yeah, those are my
it's crazy. 3 people in here are all like, when he said that thing about pastors' kids, me, you, and in here, and when he was like, hey, most of those leaders end up being pastors' kids, I was like, insane, because that's literally like Ore and I wanted to say it, but I didn't want to cut him off. But I was like, it's crazy, because it's like it's those people who have been in those communities that then, like, I like what he said about they find the best possibility for community, and then they want to see that imagined. And I was like, yeah, that's very cool. But you should definitely ask the question about sustainability, because I had the exact same question. So it's like, we're very aligned. Literally tell him like, okay, with what we're building now, like in the long term, how could that be sustainable? And what have you seen these communities have done successfully? You know, like we could implement and things like that, especially within the, like he kept saying, like within the Nigerian context, like what works in a place that's like super religious. And then another thing is like Nigeria is very communal, like just we're like very community driven within our culture, where like you're always helping your extended family, or
whether
like,
you like it or not. That's the sense of obligation that I want to talk about. Like it's actually a thing. And I think that the part that strikes me the most when it comes to sustainability is financial models. We know that so many times when we talk about the church, one of the things that people talk about the most is financial accountability, how, you know, pastors, you know, they use the buying of jets and tithes and offering and all that. And to be fair, someone who has grown up as a pastor's kid, that's like 0.01% of pastors. The rest of them actually sacrifice more than they get. You get, like, it is, growing up a pastor's kid was watching my dad, you know, give out things that we didn't even get in the house just because one church member needs it and stuff like that. So the financial model bits, like I'm going to go and be stalking Casper after today, like give me your research. I need to know, because it's important that we build like communities that actually work over time. I want to hear from Trap and Shegun.
Oh yeah, you guys. Hi.
Hi guys.
Going to meet.
Hi.
I'm so sorry. Like I wasn't like 100% present. I have to work on the other side. So, but I think one of the part like is mentioned that really resonates with me is the fact of like everybody actually need to be part of a community.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like somehow, I think almost everybody, like we are actually part of community. So couple of, like, 2 years ago, I moved from like Abeokuta, I used to say, moved to Lagos. So I don't have friends around. Till now, I don't really have friends. But like I'm part of some community online. It has been really, really helpful, meet people and stuff. That's like really makes sense. And like I would say like one of the best that like that happened to me is being part of this community. So I think that's really, really cool.
Oh, that's sweet. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Hi, Shegun. Is it here? Can Shegun hear me?
Sorry, I'm going to end the breakout room thing because and close all rooms and put people back in.
I feel like many people would have used the breakout room to leave.
Yeah. So all breakout rooms will leave in a few seconds. Hi, everyone. We're back. I think some people went out because I kept seeing requests for people to come back in. And so I'm admitting everyone back in now. I'm seeing a bunch of people trying to get back in. But yes, I think we're going to jump into Q&A. because from our break, at least our breakout room was very interesting. And we had a bunch of questions. And so if people have questions, because I think Casper's last question was, what questions do you have? This will be the time to ask them. So you can just raise your hand. There's the hand raising thing in the reactions, and then we will go one by one and answer the questions. Ideally, for people who don't want to talk, we tell them to put it in the chat. But since we're having so many issues with the chat and with the bots and the spam, I'm afraid to like put chat back on. So for now, please just raise your hand with the reaction and ask your question. So yes, you guys, you can, or do you want to start? Yeah.
Okay. Always putting me on the spot. Thank you. So Casper, thank you very much for your talk. And I'd actually read the How We Gather report twice before today. So I kind of have, some insight into the research that was done. But what I found more interesting today and what I would like to ask about is, defining, spirituality as a whole concept, right? The whole thing, like if you were to define spirituality for us, what would you define it as? Secondly, from, your research with communities, when you define the ethos of a community or the values, right, there's always somebody that will be left out. I like to say that a community is a circle and a circle has a circumference. So when you bring people in, some people will be left out. So for instance, we say that the table is for people who are quote unquote deconstructing their faith, but also still finding a sense of wonder in pursuing spirituality. So if you're not within that context, you may not find it very profitable. So what are some things that, the communities that you've worked with, what have they learned in keeping together their ethos and their values to making sure that everybody gets the best out of the community? And then finally, maybe this will be a further conversation with you outside of here, but like I'm curious to learn some of the models that have worked, from the communities that you have interacted with, especially the financial models, sustainability, water in the well or water from the well and all that. So thank you.
Wow. All right. Those are great questions. Okay, let's take them one at a time. Yeah. How do we define spirituality? That's a big question with no easy answers, but certainly in our work for Sacred Design Lab, and I'll post a link here to read more, the language that we found that really resonated in our context, especially speaking into the secular world about how to think about spirituality, was the 3 Bs. So we talk about belonging, becoming, and beyond. So when we talk about spirituality, what we're pointing to is people's experience of connection to, in the kind of belonging frame, connection to themselves, to other people, to the natural world, maybe even to history, to place, to peoplehood, right? That sense that there are multiple layers of belonging. It's not just your friendship with your best friends or your relationship with your family, but that there's these concentric circles of belonging. So that's part one, is belonging. Becoming was that sense of responding to the call from, whether it's from God or the world or however we phrase that, of becoming the kind of person that I want to be, that sense of a deepening growth in terms of the virtues, or courage and commitment, or patience, whatever it feels like, that we are becoming more of who we want to be in the world. So belonging, becoming, and then beyond was that sense of being part of something bigger than ourselves. We often talk about that sense of beyond as being one where we both look up maybe at the night sky and feel totally, totally small in the context of the cosmos, but at the same time, we're so fully part of it that we're actually very big. So it's being fully small and fully big at the same time. That's how we think about that sense of beyond. So, I think there's not, even scholars of religion can't agree on how to define religion. They certainly can't define spirituality. I think in everyday language, often people say spirituality when they mean non-institutional. So if religion suggests institution, spirituality suggests personal. And I think that's beautiful, but it's also insufficient, right? Because it sometimes isolates it just in the individual and doesn't make space for community, or doesn't make space for mutuality and responsibility to each other. So I think that the kind of the part of spirituality culture, certainly in the United States, that I find most difficult is when it's just about you and your tarot cards, and like there's no sense of connection to the world around you or responsibility for one another. So I don't know, there's some thoughts on spirituality to speak to your first question. In response to your second question about that sense of like inside and outside, or the boundaries of a community, I think you're very astute to think about that, because there's a desire, certainly for those of us in the kind of progressive space, to be really welcoming and to be really open, and to make that boundary very, very small, because we want people to feel safe. We want them to feel invited. But at the same time, a community is often at its strongest when we know who's part of us and who isn't. And so I do think it's important to think about, is there a kind of threshold moment when people who were outsiders become insiders, and also when people who are insiders step out, right? Like what's the way that we can know who the we is? So that might be as simple as, like, you know, in a traditional congregation, I've seen people signing a membership book. That's a big step and often takes people a while to get there. So it might be more about like, do we all know the same songs? Or have we had a shared experience that was transformative in some way? Maybe we went on a trip together, or we did something that was difficult, but we made it through. You know, trying to think about like, what are the shared experiences, or what are the shared knowledge indicators that means that like you're part of us now. That's, I think, a real challenge when we're thinking about designing for communities. You might enjoy having a look, if you haven't already come across this, at the community canvas that takes you through a number of those kind of questions of like, how do you design for a healthy community? Let me just give you the website, because I think does a really nice job of thinking about both some examples and some kind of processes to design for a community. So that's my answer for your second one. And then finally, yeah, what are some financial models that have been inspiring or interesting? That's really informed a lot of what we've done with the nearness. So you'll see that even though we talk about the nearness as becoming a community, we're starting it off, and I'll just share that link in the chat as well. We're starting it off as an 8-week journey, because having a beginning and having an end made it much more yesable. That's the made up word that I use. But essentially, people feel more confident making a commitment if you know that there's an end date. And I think that's one of the challenges with designing for community, is that it can feel like, oh gosh, well, now I have to be here every time, or how am I going to get out of this if I can't make it? Or, you know, it starts to feel overwhelming. So making it a really clear beginning and an end allows you to make a clear commitment, but it also allows you to make a clear financial ask. Now, in the nearness, we had a specific price point, but we also said, you know, if that isn't a fit, you can pay what you can. So there was an option of a totally free scholarship, but there was also an option of like, well, if you can't pay the full price, maybe you can pay half or 3/4 or 1/4 or whatever you can afford is a good option. And I'm just trying to think of another article. Maybe I can share this with Kamsi later, but there's a great article about the challenges of the gift economy. Because again, I want to make things as accessible and as easy to appreciate as possible, easy to join as possible. But if it doesn't work financially, it's just not going to be sustainable. So trying to be as transparent about the financial needs that make the community work is really crucial. And also trying to find mixed streams of income or revenue. Just a practical story, when we launched Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, this was my co-founder Vanessa and I, we launched it actually as an in-person community that met every Wednesday night for 2 hours, and we talked about the books, we talked about our lives, and we tried to do that thing of being clear about our needs, and we said, for this to work, everyone needs to put in $10 every time, and the average donation was $4.50. And so like at the end of the year, we were just like, well, we can't do this again. It can't sustain itself. And so that's when we thought, can we make this a podcast? And the benefit of making it a podcast was it gave us multiple revenue streams. So first of all, of course, many more people could listen than just the 30 people who showed up every week. But secondly, as the show grew, we were able to have advertising revenue. We were able to start a Patreon. So we had community contributions as well as advertising. Then we launched merchandise. So we had merch. Then we did live shows. So we had ticket sales. And finally, we were still able to do some partnerships and grants and things which brought in additional income. So suddenly we had 5 sources of revenue, which together made it a viable organization. So sometimes the format of how the community works needs to shift in order to make it financially viable. But it is not easy. And I say that again, because we're still figuring it out for the nearness. You know, one of the reasons we wanted to make it a peer facilitated model was that it's impossible to pay for, unless you make it thousands of dollars, to have each small group be facilitated by an expert. So we chose to design something that could scale a lot, which meant that the price could be relatively low. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. This is very interesting because over the last week, I've been thinking about, you know, we created the table and I want it to go on without me or without Kamsi. So if there comes a time when we're unable to be there, that it's sustainable. But I also think of it sometimes as a transient community. And I think that's fine as well. So people are in this stage of their journey, they can find companionship, and sometimes they have to go and then either go back to the communities they came from or find new communities, and that's fine as well. So these are very, very interesting models to consider as we go forward. Thank you, Casper.
Well, thank you. And I think you're completely right. You know, not everything is meant to last forever. And I think there's a sense that like it's failed unless it lasts forever. And that's not true, right? Like something can live for a time. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Okay, so there is a question. Okay.
I was going to say, I see Emmanuel's question. Yeah. Who asks, how do these new groups avoid good question, Emmanuel. How do they avoid problems faced in traditional religious groups? Even amongst insiders, there isn't always uniformity. Well, Emmanuel, you've hit the nail on the head, because absolutely the same problems happen. So one of the things that we saw, for example, and even problems, well, let me not get ahead of myself. Yes, you see the same dynamics. One of my favorite examples was in Soul Cycle. Again, a fitness community, very high price point, very kind of not for everyone. But it's a stationary bike experience, right? It's an exercise class on stationary bikes. But really, that's just the excuse. What happens during that 45 minutes workout is that there are like lights and there's very loud music, and the instructor is really preaching. It's a 45-minute liturgy where they're taking you through an emotional journey. And towards the end, there is what is known as the hill climb. So this is when you're putting the resistance up really high on the bike, and you're pushing and you're pushing and you're sweating. And everyone always kept crying. There was this whole phenomenon of everyone crying during the hill climb. And I went to a number of classes with Angie, and we heard the instructors at different times. One of them basically gave a eulogy for their father-in-law who had just died. Other times people would talk about big issues in the world. Like, it was this sense of emotional kind of nearly manipulation, honestly, that would happen during this time. So that's what Soul Cycle is like. It's this very kind of intense emotional fitness experience. But here's what was interesting. Because the class was set up with rows and rows of bicycles, in 2 particular venues in New York City and in a very exclusive beach town near New York, you could not just book your class at the same time as everyone else, 12 p.m. on a Monday for the coming week, but if you paid $10,000 additional dollars, you got access to booking your bike a whole day before. And the reason people wanted to do this is because then they could sit in the front row of the exercise class, which, is exactly the same as what happens in a congregation where people pay for pews. This is something that you saw in the New England region of the United States a lot, where very prominent families, who give the most to the congregation, have not just sit in the front rows, but have their names in little plaques on the pews. And so what I'm pointing to is that the same dynamics of human, shall we say, shortcomings apply in these new communities just as they did in religious spaces. But here's where I want to point to your question as being particularly insightful. Not only were there these existing problems, but often these people who were in new positions of religious authority, right? Like, let's say a CrossFit trainer wasn't just there to teach you how to do squats and burpees and lift weights, but now they were also there to help you navigate the death of your mother or a divorce or a diagnosis, but they didn't have any of that training. So we saw, for example, lots of stories of trainers having relationships with their clients which, you know, at the best of times is not a good idea. But if you're also in a pastoral relationship, that's a big, 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 big no-no. So I would say not only did we see some of the traditional mistakes happening, we also saw things that you would hope to avoid, but we all know stories of pastors who had relationships with their congregants. So it's, again, I fear it's more of the same. So yes, these communities are not immune. That is what to do. Oh my gosh. Well, that is the question we're all trying to figure out. But I think one of the things that is really important is for us to figure out new pathways of leadership development and formation, because, you know, we're all liable to make mistakes. But where are the relationships of support and accountability that help us, whether we're in a traditional congregation or we're in a fitness community or a digital network or whatever it is? What are the places where we get to grow into the kind of leaders that we want to become? And so I'm really interested in like new systems of theological formation or theological education. What are the new pathways in which we get to reflect together and make meaning of the places where we know there's something that could go wrong, or we know we need some extra help? Who are the elders who are accompanying us? I think these are the kind of new structures and systems that we will need to have. And I have to say, looking in the United States, it's the seminaries that are a little behind, shall we say. They're still training people for a world that is no longer here. It's for a world that was real 20 or 30 years ago. So it takes a while for those systems to catch up with where we are. So if you can create, you know, spaces like the table, I think it's beautiful, because it creates a place for people to meet and make meaning together, and to kind of lean into that sense of growth, which isn't provided for in the institutional religious church, in the church or in theological education. That's a great question, Emmanuel.
I see one hand up. I can't. Oh, Aina. Wow. Go ahead.
Hi, I had a quick question. I was just wondering how, like, a time that you've seen in any of these communities where, like, family, or in terms of like actual like members, especially kids, are like involved, because a lot of the examples that you gave were obviously like for something like the table community, you're not going to see like a 7 or 8 year old. But I think one of the reasons why like a lot of people are disillusioned by like the communities, like especially religious communities, is because they came into them like as kids and then kind of like felt like they were brainwashed and like learned things that they had to like unlearn when they were older. But a lot of these communities that are forming, obviously it's going to be, you're not going to have like 8-year-olds going to Soul Cycle. And so how like they're able to like kind of like instill these kind of like these values that they're getting in like younger people that will like continue to join those communities is kind of like my question.
I love this question, Yina. It's really astute. And there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is that this is definitely a shortcoming, I would say, of this landscape of these new communities, is that they are very focused on the individual. And so you're absolutely right to notice that trend amongst the projects that I highlighted. Secondly, I would say part of the reason that happens is that people often design for themselves. So as these younger people are trying to create the thing that they're missing, they're creating it for themselves. And so as they're aging now, we are seeing more projects that are a little bit more like young family focused, because now these people have kids. So we're starting to see that. One example that might be interesting is Brooklyn Boulders. This is a climbing gym that also is a co-working space, of course. And so it started in Brooklyn, but it's also in Chicago and a couple of other spaces around the country. And what was interesting was because it was both this kind of fitness and working space, that it had to be a little more family friendly, because people were bringing their kids. And so what you started to see was like yoga classes for kids or climbing classes for kids. So often it was the kind of activities that the adults were doing, but then made appropriate for children. And I would say there was a little bit of kind of theological messaging in there in terms of like, why do we pay attention to our breath and consciousness and blah, 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 blah. But there wasn't the kind of like doctrinal teaching of like, these are the stories, or this is how the world was made, or this is what God thinks about A, B, and C. However, I think for me, the solution to this question, because a lot of young parents that we've encountered say, I want to pass on values to my children, but I don't trust the synagogue or the mosque or the church to do that. It's not what I want. But I don't know how to do it by myself. And I think this is a real pain point for a lot of young families, because if they If they don't give anything, all they get is like consumptive capitalism, right? Which they also don't just want. But if they give something, it's not going to be quite what they want. And so I don't know what the solution will be. There's some interesting projects in the Jewish space. One of them is called PJ Libraries, which is essentially a book giving service where it's like a subscription service for books. And so PJ Libraries, if you're on their list and your kid is aged, you know, between 2 and 5, you get a book every month on their curriculum. If they're aged 6 to 10, you get the next curriculum or something like that. But essentially, they're kind of distributing the kind of the products of spiritual formation, but they don't have the community. And so trying to find ways in which those people can find each other is a real challenge for them. But if you have good ideas, I think the market is ready for it, because folks are struggling with exactly that question of navigating formation without indoctrination. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think that the picture is like in Nigeria, Yina? What resonates for you in what I've shared from what you've seen in your national context?
It's kind of funny because now I haven't been in Nigeria for like a few years. So it's actually hard to know how like this space is like has changed. I'm sure like I can imagine, especially amongst like the younger like educated folks, that like now this is, I feel like a lot of people are finding spaces in like their gyms or like just places that they go out to and making communities there than you normally would when you like thinking about a lot of the friends I had were either from like either school or church, like growing up, versus like now those are places where I'm finding friends. And I had actually a follow-up question based on what you said. Kind of, especially now that these communities, and you kind of touched on this, like a lot of these communities are like, for example, people that are paying to go to like SoulCycle, like CrossFit, come from money. And how like kind of the gray line between where it becomes like a capitalist scheme versus like an actual community. I'm thinking about something like WeWork, and like when they first started, and like there was like a WeWork school, and it was just more than co-working, and then it became like a huge thing. I think what's interesting about that is kind of like when it becomes like, less of, they're using community as like an advertising scheme, obviously, and because of people really want that so much, they buy into it. So yeah, I'm just like curious about that as well.
Yeah, we call it community washing. You know, that experience of greenwashing where companies would talk about how ethical they were or how sustainable they were when actually they weren't. I think you're exactly right. A lot of organizations are using that language of community without really actually giving community. What they're talking about is like customers or brand, but it's not actually the experience of community. And I think a shorthand for community is not just like, are we in a network and we interact in some way? It's like, do you show up if my mom dies, right? Like, will you, and not just, this is one of the biggest challenges for digital spaces, that we're not in proximity enough to notice before you tell me. So a lot of digital communities rely on disclosure for me to tell you when something goes wrong, rather than you being close enough to my life to notice that it's wrong in the first place. And that's a real challenge for digital community design, but I'm going on a different path. So yes, I think you're seeing brands use that language a lot, and I don't think they deliver, partly because the incentives for companies is ultimately to make money, right? That primary purpose is not to create community, it's to extract value from the customer. And so those two things will very quickly get into competition of like an experience of community versus the kind of revenue that they can get out of us. So that's the first part. And then secondly, yes, a lot of these case studies that I was pointing to are not nonprofits or cooperatives, they are private companies. So SoulCycle, WeWork, CrossFit, all of these are private companies that are trying to make as much money as possible. Now, there is a little difference here, I think, even between SoulCycle and CrossFit, because SoulCycle very quickly was sold to a parent company, and CrossFit remains a private kind of like family-owned company. It was owned by it then sold a stake in Reebok, but for a long time, it was privately owned, which meant that the founders could say things like, yeah, we could create a merchandise shop in every gym, but we're not going to do that because we know it will destroy the community. And the community is more important to us than the quick buck that we can make. So there is some finesse, there's some difference in each company because they have different values and different strategies. But I think it's something to be very, very careful to keep an eye out, especially when the ownership is no longer part of the original team who still hold the values and is sold to a parent company who just wants to make as much money as possible. Now, having said that, I also don't want us to have this image of religion as this pure place where money does not matter. I mean, surely we've all heard the fundraising and the money ambitions in a religious community, right? Like a religious community is always an economic community also. So I don't want us to create this, you know, this dichotomy of purity and foulness or you know, defiled. Like every community is always interacting with money. And so we have to get used to knowing how to talk about it and how to navigate it. But there's definitely some ways that are better than others. Yeah.
That was very interesting for you to point out, because one of the grounds that most people have with religion in Nigeria, if you look at the conversations that happen in digital spaces like Twitter, for instance, the major thing whenever people want to talk about church or what they hate about church the most would be the tithes and the offerings and what they would think is misappropriation by pastors and stuff like that. But I grew up a pastor's kid, and I know that the pastors that, you know, make that kind of money, like 1% of all pastors. I watched my dad give out things that we needed in the house because some members of the church needed them. I watched him give out my room to someone else to stay in while I slept on the couch. And I became a pastor at some point when I was in university, not pastor in that sense, but like a student hall pastor, hostel pastor. And I also know the sacrifices I had to make for that. So there's a very weird relationship that religion has with money. For some people, it's that they are taking too much. For some people, but the actual people that do the work know that it's a lot of sacrifice as well. So finding that balance is going to be really tricky for me now as a person. And I don't know if this is something that you've experienced or have done some research on.
Yeah, I love that illustration. Thank you for sharing it. And I can't say I've done extensive research, but I can certainly share my own personal experience, which is, yeah, the conflict, right, that we feel internally. Because on the one hand, you know, I want to be paid fairly for the work that I do. And, you know, there's no reason why I shouldn't when everyone else is, or not everyone else is, but other people are. And on the other hand, I'm like, well, I'm not here because I think this is going to make me rich. Like, this was not a strategy of like wealth generation, right? I'm here because I care, and I care about this purpose, and I care about this mission and the work that we're doing. And so I think it's a constant negotiation. And I think I really appreciate you pointing out to the reality of most religious leaders is that this is not a wealth building thing. But for the people who get the most press and where the most of the attention is, you know, they're driving around in a Rolls Royce, and that paints, it damages everyone, because it makes it into a caricature. It cheapens the work that everyone is doing. And so, you know, I think that's why the kind of peer-to-peer accountability in leadership is so important, because you need each other to hold each other accountable when we're in leadership, so we don't get, you know, run away with our own selfishness or our own grandiosity, the stories of importance that we have. And, you know, I like nice things, and so I definitely have moments where I'm like, do I really need these new shoes? And there are times when I've said, no, I don't. And there are times when I've said, yes, you know, screw it. And like, I'm ashamed of that, you know, and it's, I know I have that tendency, and so I need help.
Well,
I
you
need
shouldn't
help.
be, though. That's the point.
Well, I mean, that depends, right? Yes, we all need new shoes, but do we need those particular shoes? Or I don't think I did.
Fair enough. What's the difference between, so there's a way that, is it Brian Zand or Brad Jessak, one of them defined, I'm trying to remember who exactly, it's William Paul Young, I think, who defined love as self-giving instead of selfless. Like, you don't have to give less of yourself, you don't have to be less of yourself, or you can give of yourself that you already are. So but a lot of people do not think of of it as that. Like, I'm still a person, even in ministry, right? I'm still a person, even though I'm serving this community, and my needs are there, the community needs are there, and it will always be this tussle of which to do first. And many people grow up, especially if you grow up in church, your entire idea of leadership is service and giving and all that. But I know that I resented my dad a lot. For many of the sacrifices that he made for the church. And if I will be that person, if I will serve community, I want to be able to find that balance, especially also if you have kids. So it's a lot of tricky, what else to go through.
Yeah. Well, and I, just to resonate a little with your parental experience, my mother, we as I said, we didn't grow up in the church, but my mom was very involved in our community. Yeah. And there were always people sleeping in our house. And sometimes that was the spare bedroom, right? We ran a bed and breakfast, and we had lodgers, and we had friends and other people who needed a place to stay. But sometimes it was my bedroom. And I think that's where that's where the kind of resistance comes to, right? It's one thing for you to give of yourself. It's another thing to give of your family without them agreeing to it. Especially when I was a teenager, I got very frustrated with that. So I think that's the balance, right? Of like, but at the same time, that experience helped me learn what it is to be hospitable, right? And it was a valuable lesson. And yes, maybe it was annoying that they were in my bedroom, but actually it was beautiful once we were around the table together having dinner, and I was, learning from these French people who happened to be there. Or, right now my parents are hosting a Ukrainian family. But it's something that for me is a sign of health for any community. Is this community not just serving themselves, but serving others, right? Is what's happening in this community good and holy, that it's being taken out into the world and it's being of service? Because if a community is only for itself, I think over time it will die. It needs to be alive. It needs to be generative. It needs to be open and generous in that way. Yeah. I see Kamsi has a hand as well.
Yes, I have a question based off of what everyone has been saying. And I don't know how to frame my question properly, but I hope you guys will understand it. So based on what Yina was saying, Ore was saying, and whatnot, bringing it back to Nigerian context, Nigeria is in our breakout room, we're talking about Nigeria is very communal, like inherently compared to America. America is very individualistic. And so that sense of connection, like people go out of their way for extended families, people live within their extended families, people are very community driven in Nigeria. But at the same time, like these sorts of new spiritual communities we're talking about sound very, will I say privileged? Like, we're talking about Soul Cycle and there's a price point. We're talking about like dinner parties. We're talking about things that really sound like they're for people who are privileged. And not a lot of people are here in Nigeria, especially we find that like even deconstruction, I think there was a time we were talking about it and we're like, there's a certain amount of privilege you have to be able to participate in deconstruction, because if you don't have access to resources and literacy, you're going to depend on the church for your sense of community and fundraising and things like that. So it's like these new spaces we're creating, my worry is that they're very privileged and they're only for privileged people. And so how do we make them more accessible, basically? So yeah, that's a trend I keep seeing.
100%, Kamsi. There's a number of things that you're raising here that I think are really important. The first is that's absolutely true, and certainly in the communities that we found, that was a consistent pattern. What's interesting in the numbers, when you look at the disaffiliation statistics in the United States, it kind of goes across two particular income ranges or wealth gaps. So there's absolutely the more privileged, which associated with higher education. They're more coastal. In the United States, they're more likely to be white, right? All sorts of data pieces about who's disaffiliating. But there was a second category of people who were disaffiliated, and it was less about theological difference or wanting to move away from the church, and it was about access. It was people who were working jobs with shifts that were, they couldn't plan around them, so they couldn't regularly attend a community. It was people who didn't have enough money for car and for their rent. So they couldn't access a community that was physically further away, that they couldn't get to through public transit or walking or cycling or something. So there was an access issue, even in the statistics. So that's completely true in the first one. The second one, all of this research was also shaped by us. You know, we went looking for communities that we could recognize. And so they had a Squarespace website, they had a logo, they were out there trying to get other people to come and join. That's why they were online. But for a number of communities, there was no desire for that kind of attention. So they were much more difficult to find. And that was very much stratified by class. So this secondly is a fault on our part of what we were able to find in our research. But then finally, I think there's an absolute question of, even in the US, where race is such a boundary, I think even more difficult perhaps than a multiracial community is a multi-class community. But for all of the reasons that you pointed to, in education level, the access to the community, the norms of how a community behaves, what people want from a community. So I'm really interested in looking at the communities that create cross-class as well as cross-race relationships. And often those are very intentionally built around that. So one of them that I really love is called Thread, which is in Baltimore, which is really built around a sort of new structure of family, where a young person aged between 14 and 18 who's at a high risk of dropping out of high school essentially gets paired with 3 to 4 adults whose job is to love them. So rather than a program where there's classes or experience or A, B, and C, that's not the program. The whole program is that these 4 adults do for this child what they would do for their own child. And what's really beautiful is they don't just measure the impact on the young person, you know, who's more likely to be much lower income. It's more likely to be a person of color in the city of Baltimore, right? Not only do they look at their outcomes, and of course they're amazing in terms of graduation and going on to college, but they also look at the outcomes for these volunteers who are more likely to be wealthier, more likely to be white, more likely to be new to the city of Baltimore, because these people they're more likely to be lonely. They're more likely to feel like they don't have as much meaning in their life. And so they measure the impact on the volunteers as well. And what I love about this is that it illustrates that these relationships are enriching for both people. And over time, what they create are these new structures of familial responsibility and love that change everyone. And that takes a huge amount of effort to build. The reason they're still only in Baltimore, even after a decade, is because they are working so hard to get the model exactly right for their context. So they've not wanted to scale. But I think that kind of example illustrates that it can be done, but it takes incredible dedication and really smart strategy of thinking about what are the multiple outcomes that we can measure. They're very, very data-driven, which is particularly cool.
Interesting. I don't see any other raised hands or questions in the group. So I'm just wondering, does anyone else have questions? Because we actually have 10 more minutes and we can close out, and we try to close out on time all the time. So I'm just giving anyone who has a question a last chance to ask their question. If not,
Hi.
Oh, okay.
So this is not as much a question, it's much more some curiosities. For instance, just personal, right? What stage are you in your degree at Harvard? I know you're doing something on public policy and divinity. How's that going for you personally?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I came to America for graduate school in 2012, and I did a joint degree between public policy and divinity. So that was 4 years of school. So I graduated in 2016. But sometimes I still think to myself, should I do a PhD? And then I remember, no, I shouldn't. But I love, well, mostly because I'm really a practitioner. You know, I love learning, but I always love learning in partnership with making. And so for me, creating the nearness with my team has been a really beautiful experience of trying to implement some of the insights from the research and from some of the learning. Because for me, the research and the scholarship is always in service of actually doing something with it.
Yeah.
You know, I think for me, just learning by itself is not enough. Like, I want to apply it. So who knows, maybe down the line, there'll be like a part-time PhD or something. But for now, I'm really just focused on implementing. Yeah.
Okay, so speaking to that, then, if you ever think of implementing in Africa or Nigeria, just some further research into how we gather, we'll be happy to help.
Well, it's funny that you say that, Ori, because we are actually about to start a project for the Templeton World Charity Foundation, looking at spiritual innovation from a global context, because all our work has been so US focused. So we're really interested in, if you think of something like Headspace, right? They took meditation practice, put it in an app, and now it has millions and millions of users. Or if you think about mindfulness-based stress reduction, again, a meditation example, but they used a kind of a research agenda to illustrate the impact, the benefits of meditation, and so used hospitals and healthcare systems as a way of spreading that particular practice. So the foundation that we're working with is really interested in what are other potential spiritual innovations that could reach millions and millions of people at scale. And so our job is to understand what spiritual innovation looks like in the Middle East, in Japan, in South Africa, in Europe, in all of these different places. So I would love to hear from you. And let me put my email address in the chat box, because just in case anyone has any links or leads, please let me know. But we would love to learn where you're seeing interesting examples of new ways in which people are connecting with religion or spirituality or community in Nigeria, because we would love to learn about it. And we can set up a research interview and talk more, but that would be super fun.
Yes, absolutely. This is actually a major high point for me right now. So thank you.
I'm so glad you asked. Yeah. And I will say my colleague Sue is leading. We had to divide the different regions of the world. So I'm leading on Europe and the Middle East. She's leading on Australasia and Africa. So if you end up having a research interview, you'll probably get to talk to Sue, who's just the best. She officiated my wedding. I love her very much.
Oh, that's good. Thank you, Casper.
Thank you, Ori. So great to see you. And, let me just say this maybe as a final word, which is I was so thrilled when Kamsi reached out, because I think one of the benefits, obviously, of the digital world that we live in is we get to have these conversations across geographies. And it's so interesting to me to learn more about the Nigerian experience and what these questions look like in your context, whether you're living in Nigeria or not. And to just learn more from what you're doing and what you're imagining, because I know that my work can benefit from your insight. So thank you for being so generous to welcome me.
On that note, thank you so much, Casper, for joining us. I don't think anyone else has questions, right? Yeah, because I see no raised hands and no points. But if anyone does have questions, you can always send them in our group chat, and I'd be happy to send them to Casper, and I'm sure he'd be happy to get back to you, and I'd get you those answers if you need to. And yes, his email is there, so you can email him as well directly. So that would be awesome. So on that note, thank you so much, Casper, for your time and for your research and sharing those insights with us. That was really good. And this is recorded, so for all the people that missed that, we'll put it up on our YouTube channel, and I'll share that link with you as well, Casper. So yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you for everyone who took our time to join on a Monday evening, even though today is a public holiday. And yeah, like we always say, we have no closing prayers here. That's it. Thank you guys for joining us. Yes.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Kamsi.
Bye, Casper.
Bye, Casper. Bye,
folks.
Bye. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Kamsi.
Bye. See you on WhatsApp.